Hi, welcome to More Crisis, a channel dedicated to Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox alike. Today I'm joined once more by my two good friends, Matt of Logos Made Flesh and Thomas of Storytellers. So I'm really looking forward to a conversation with those two about, in particular, Rod Dreher's most recent book, Live Not by Lies, and touching upon a wonderful film named A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick. So welcome to you both. I'd just like to quote a bit from Rod's book here to get us started. So he says in that book, under the dictatorship of Big Brother, building it upon 1984 and so forth, the party understands that by changing language, newspeak, it's called in the book, is the party's word for that's the jargon it imposes in society. It controls the categories in which people think. So then freedom becomes slavery, truth is falsehood, and so forth. Doublethink then is holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. So, this is a problematic, logically speaking. I want to ask you about this kind of hijacking of language and how that affects film and things that you're interested in, and are there any concerns that you have and things you'd like to say about that? How do you? I suppose to kind of frame it. So since we appreciate Pajot's channel and things he's been saying, so he goes into how symbolism is being hijacked, so that everything is about the feminist kind of trope and the way they frame Moana and everything. I was wondering, are there any other concerns like that you have about this manipulation of language and seeing language or even media in general as mere propaganda and so forth? If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, I think I don't necessarily think that just having movies that are like what you could call propaganda, like one or two, or like every now and then, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It could just be like a bad movie, or the script could be bad. But I do think it becomes a problem when those are the types of stories that are dominant in, for instance, on Netflix. You really saw, I think, this year a pretty big shift towards like a lot of woke type stories and these weird subversive types of stories, or nihilistic type of stories that are put. And for instance, the movie Cuties, which is like a big example. Like a lot of people pushed back on that, like pretty across the board, right? But I think what I didn't, before I read Rod's book, I suppose I didn't really reflect on like how it could really have a huge impact, because we do have, like, it's not like we live in China and we only have these types of stories. We also still have, the classics, and we have good stories. So it's not like we only consume these types of things. But the only thing I did realize that this is what's being pushed, but we still have alternatives. But what Rod talks about, and I think in his book, is how it's possible for almost any other type of narrative to be completely like pushed to the margins, or basically completely be excluded from the discussion or society, so to say. So I think that there could be a situation where you only have those stories, and that where newer generations don't even know that there is, let's say, an alternative. And I think at that point it does become dangerous. Now, I guess my question was, because we live in the Western world, how far can something like that go for us today? And that's, I guess that was one of the questions that I had myself. So I don't really have the answer to that, how far it can go.
It's interesting. Thank you, Thomas. Is there anything you'd like to add to that there, Matt?
Well, so you're talking about language and how doublespeak, and obviously the newspeak is kind of shaping the way that we perceive or interact with the world around us, and basically how it's being opposed upon us, so that we're kind of going along march, and with going along with the culture at large, because they're defining how we're supposed to see everything by the language that we're using. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And how we see that, and what's the broader question you're asking? Is it where I see that and how we can interact with that, or what we see in stories?
I guess, how do we as Christians avoid being misinformed and having our imaginations and so forth misshapen by that media whenever it's so prominent, and then even across generations? How do we bring our children up and so forth. So in Dreher's book, he talks about how they would form these kind of parallel communities and so forth, that they would resist a more heavy totalitarianism but are hard totalitarianism. Whereas I think, as Thomas is saying there, we have this now soft totalitarianism, so soft in some ways that we don't even realize that it's totalitarian. It's just part of the water that we swim in. How do we convince Christians that this is actually a problem in the first place whenever it's presented? Even so, say issues like identity, the way they're portrayed, sexual identity and everything through Netflix, it's presented in a way of emancipation, that you're becoming this person who you're meant to be or whatever. But that's different in many ways to what the Christian faith describes, which actually says that, say, your perverse sexual desires are not your personality. And how do we, I guess, evangelize in that culture versus, I think you've mentioned this before, Matt, about how people don't know that they're sinners, and that message of you're in a state of sin and need repentance spoke to them. How do we speak to those persons now in this day and age, do you think?
Well, I think in terms of just so basically storytelling and language, the stories we tell and the language we use are in essence the same thing. And I think we need to say that. So basically, we're not just talking about newspeak would include language, but language is a product and also used in our stories. So the stories we tell, the memories that the cultural memories, the things that we emphasize, the symbols we use, all those type of things are part and parcel to our language. So it's interesting that the news stories of what Thomas was talking about are coming up, these news stories, because they're really shaping the way we are using our language. The stories that we tell are references to the stories the language we use is a reference to the stories that we tell, and our memories, our cultural memories, the things that we share and all that stuff. So in terms of how Christians can give this get a real sense of self, I think that's more along the line. So if we want to be unshakable, unflappable when it comes to this soft totalitarianism, this encroachment of these other stories, is that we need to know our story, our language well. And it was funny to me growing up in the church. I remember people used to think that Christianese, have you heard the phrase Christianese before? It's a phrase that came up because I grew up in evangelical circles, and they would always talk about how Christians would have these shorthand references or ways of talking about things that seemed rather strange or odd to people who weren't inside the church. So in fact, I think there's some videos on YouTube that kind of make fun of this whole idea, because what happens is that, you would talk about, well, I felt the Lord moving me, or I felt, I heard his voice, or you start saying these type of things, and people on the outside are like going, I have no idea what you're talking about. So when I was growing up and they would talk about trying to witness or share your faith, they would always say, don't use Christianese, get away from Christianese, because Christianese is a dialect which other people don't understand. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? They don't know, because it's a different language, a different dialect. So, but the more I thought about it, the more I started getting into language and storytelling and all that stuff, is that, Christianese is the foundation for who we are as a people. It's like saying, don't speak your language, your dialect, because other people can't understand it. Well, what are you doing at that moment? At that moment, you say, I'm not going to speak my dialect. I'm going to capitulate to the larger culture. I'm just going to give over what is core and significant to who I am as a people. Instead of bringing people over to you, you've now all of a sudden shifted the focus going over to them. So for me, I think Christianese, the foundation of Christianese, the foundation of a Christian culture, Christian storytelling, is knowing the Bible, the story of the Bible well. And by that, I do not mean knowing necessarily theology well, but knowing the book as a story, and the story of how it's replicated in the different instances, the different people, the characters, just also not just the story of the Bible, but also the story of the church, the story of the martyrs, this saint or this, this day, what it meant. That story, the one that they used to put in stained glass windows inside cathedrals, is the thing that is remembered. It's the thing that is the common culture. It's the core center of who we are as a people. Right. Anyway, I hope I'm not going too far on this, but my point is that if you know your story well, to have a really strong sense of self, you will not capitulate yourself to other people. But to know who you are is to know your own story and why you are the way that you are. Remembering the stories, so if you're in a situation and you want to, know why something happened, I think I'm going to go up from this. I'm sorry, guys. But when I was, the story of communion, earliest Christianity, right? What was earliest Christianity? It was people getting around and telling stories about Jesus. This is before the Gospels. Before the Gospels are written, how was the story of Jesus remembered? It was the people getting together, maybe having communion, but they would say the Lord's table, and they would say there's a situation that arises in the church, and they'd say, that reminds me of what Jesus said. Let me tell you the story about what Jesus said. I have this story with my father, my own father, probably your own parents, that you have this story that you tell about your own identity, because your parents go, hey, let me tell you a story about this time or this situation, and it brings meaning to your life. That core sense of self, core sense of family, core sense of purpose is where we're going to, that's where our distinction comes when we say, I'm not going to be the world, I'm going to be who I am. And I just think we're giving over that story, our story, constantly to the world. We say, I'm not going to, because we want to be so friendly, user friendly, come into our midst, be a part of us, that we're not telling our story, and people just come and bring in their own baggage, their own story, and we're losing what it means to be core us. So anyway, that's a very long answer.
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. It seems like what's important is that there is a type of liturgical repetition, almost not just in going to church, but just in everything that you do as well, in terms of your identity. That participation is a key. You always need to try to recenter yourself into who you are, who your family is, and what your beliefs are. In this case, our Christian beliefs, and I think it kind of, to use a frame of reference, is your video on Memento as well. What does, I forget the main character's name, but what does he do? He keeps repeating, those same things about, he hasn't written down, he has to keep repeating to know who he is and what his story is. Obviously he has this amnesia, right? Or what is it called? So he keeps forgetting. So that's the tragedy. Yeah, he has the tragedy of the story, but it does show as well what happens when you lose touch with who you are and what your identity is. And if we keep what you're saying, if we wait, that's our own story and our own language, then you tend to, maybe it won't happen over day, but you forget, in a sense, who you are, right? And so this is why you need to go ahead.
You're at the mercy of everyone else who's telling you who you are.
Yeah,
he's manipulated. He's manipulated by other people.
Right.
Exactly what you're talking about.
I think, and I think when we think of A Hidden Life, to tie it into the movie as well, I think the first half or so of the movie is them just going through the motions, right? They're farmers, and they go harvest the crops, and they play for children. So there's this sort of rhythm almost to their life, and in the movie as well. And even up till the end of the movie, you still see them working the ground, right? And it's this labor basically that keeps, I guess, reminding them also who they are, and centering themselves in this, the crazy world that they live in. And I think that recentering and what Rod talks about in his book, and talking with groups of similar-minded people, and when church is not available, that is important to keep reminding yourself of who you are and what your identity is in the world. But I guess the question that Mark asked is how you deal with that in terms of the media, and especially, I guess, if you have kids. I don't know, obviously Mark and I don't have kids yet, but I don't know how you deal with that with your kids, if at all. I wouldn't really know, I guess, how I would go about it. I've never thought about it. If that makes sense.
I mean, the way I was raised, I wasn't raised in a particularly worldview household that we talked about worldview issues a lot. So in terms of this type of stuff, and I'm more lax with my kids. I think my kids have just kind of imbibed it or picked it up as we have lived our lives. And so, we talk about things, they know that when we watch a movie, we'll talk about the meaning of a movie. So now that they see a movie, they don't know it's just a story, but it's also talking about a way of life, a way of seeing the world, a way of explaining things, or what the purpose behind it is. So, but they also know the story of the Bible pretty well, because we constantly have gone over the story of the Bible with them, and so they know it in a way that they often probably wouldn't pick it up from some of the churches that we've been to. Which, even going to our Christmas service just a few days ago, it was kind of almost like we all know the story, so we kind of quickly get over it. Like, you've all heard the story before. So let's kind of ignore it. And I'm
Yeah.
like, but that, wait, that's the whole point. You got to tell the story, and you got to keep telling that story. And even if it's repetitive, the whole point is to remember the story and know what it means. Even if you tell them what it means 100 times over, that's the point. And we got to keep going back to it. But it's almost like, let's do something new. Let's do something, let's talk about something that's maybe less boring because you've heard about this 1,000 times over, but you need to go over and over and over what is most important. Otherwise you lose it and forget it. So new people won't ever know it. So,
right. Well, I mean, it's honestly, it's almost the same as training a muscle or something like that, or a skill, you just, if you don't do it long enough, then you forget, or it becomes very diluted, your understanding of what it means. And, or even reading a book, when you go back to a book or a movie a year or a couple of years down the line, you haven't watched, you think you remember it, but then actually you don't. So I think that's the simplest way, the simplest metaphor that I guess we can use for why it's important to keep participating, even if it's the same thing over and over again. It's that's why it's important. And I think even this year, I'm sure, Mark, you've experienced it as well. Matt, you live with your family, obviously, but we're both basically alone. So in the COVID, lockdown way of living your life, it can be quite isolating as well. And I'm glad we do have the internet so that we can do things like this. But I'm an only child as well, so it's a strange experience where, especially when you have to work at home as well, you get in a weird type of tunnel vision very easily, and you tend to forget. It's like you just become uprooted, and I can imagine for kids who are in high school now, or just college, who just went to college and are going into this new life, it can be very disorienting. And I don't know what the long-term consequences of this lockdown and not going to schools and such will be for especially younger kids now that are growing up. So we don't know yet what's going to happen, but I'm fearful that is going to have lasting effects for those kids if they're not like properly grounded at a young age, So but we'll see.
Well, you look at what schools exist for, and this is interesting too in terms of our conversation. And when this soft totalitarianism, the reason we have public schools in the United States is basically to make everyone speak the same language, which is to say the same stories, to see the world the same way. And that's why the people are reluctant for homeschooling. They're reluctant for private schools. Why? Because what you do is you disintegrate the fabric between the society to saying that these, so we always call America the great melting pot. Like we all come together and we're all going to see, well, we have a great melting pot because we're not a salad. You got to come together and kind of see things the same way. And that's what school exists for, is to give people that common story, that common language. And right now, with the wokeness and everything like that, the 1619 Project, all that stuff going on, is you have a reinterpretation. Let's go in here and retwist, retrain, rethink about our story because we see it this way. We want everybody to see it our way. It's pretty, we're fragmenting in that sense. And so in essence, we don't want to capitulate to everyone else's story.
I think that's one of those things. It's obviously a threat in some ways, but it's also a good opportunity for the church to actually be the church, isn't it? We have a faithful remnant that aren't really as conditioned by the society. Maybe if they do see themselves as distinct, if you know what I mean, that Harawas and those ones talked about this in Resident Aliens, where you see yourself obviously in the world but not of it, and you have that distinct Christian character and community that has those strange kind of Christianese rituals and everything. So I think that might be the positive side, that you don't assume the maybe self-evident nature of the society in which you live. I think Carl Trueman talks about this. He talks about Charles Taylor and this notion of what is it he calls it, the poesis of today is contrasts with the mimesis of former generations, that now people think that they create their own reality and don't recognize that they are beholden to a number of these kind of different traditions and all, like you've mentioned there. And they think it's neutral, which I find amazing. Whenever I'm teaching kids in different secular schools, they will assume the neutrality and self-evidency of their education in the state school and think, this is the way it's done. This is the way be done this is the way it will always be done. And not only that, but they also buy into this notion of progress, which I've talked about a few times in this channel, where they perceive history as in all respects becoming better all the time. And I think COVID-19 has just came along, and well, it should have destroyed that myth, but I don't think it will. It seems a remarkably endurant myth that people use to sustain themselves, because I guess maybe perhaps they don't have the kingdom of God, and they don't have meaning beyond physical death and so forth, so that they have to invest all of their beliefs and religious practices in these imminent rituals. Again, that's something that it comes across in Truman's work and Charles Taylor and people like that, if that makes sense. I think for me, I would like to focus on classical education, because it ties us to that great tradition, not just in America, as you say, but the Judeo-Christian tradition that transcends borders and frees us from our idolatry, say, to the nation. I know there are patriotic elements of the nation that I like, and I'm a big fan of the American project in some ways from outside and so forth, but that we hitch ourselves to the great tradition. So Thomas sent me this wonderful book the other day about the great tradition and classical education, and you got Augustine there, you've got Martin Luther King, this whole list of people that we should, I suspect, teach to our kids, and the way they use language and everything. So it's not just seen about power, and you have that logical based grammar, rhetoric, all in the way it was taught, and it's directed towards the kingdom of God and telos, rather than what we have in our modern secular society of this blind matter moving without direction, and the elevation of the human will above all else and so forth. Because whenever you do have that, it seems to me from reading books like Truman's and so forth, that you do end up with a kind of cult of critical theory, or a strong central authority like a government that then has to be the arbiter between all these competing wills, because we are different, that that becomes their new religion, and that dictates the terms. And I think that speaks to the thesis of Rod's book, and it will manifest itself in a different way. It may not be 1984, it might be more Brave New World and the soft totalitarianism, where you're kind of you're led to believe that this is actually a good thing. And I think it speaks to Thomas's excellent video on Wally, if that makes sense. I don't want to go beyond that now, just it was a long held spiel. Do you have any thoughts on that, or anything you'd like to add about that?
I think you're right on the classical project, and basically you talked about the American project and also classical education. And I think the American project is a classical project, meaning that in the initial phase of the American project, basically independence and things like that, the whole first 50, 60 years of America was an imbibing of the classics. I mean, you Greek and Roman architecture, writing. I mean, basically, George Washington had the troops perform the play Cato several times, so they saw themselves. And what would they call George Washington was the new. Come on, what was the name of the guy who? Come on, Thomas, you know this one. The Roman general who laid down his arms. You remember this, Thomas?
Who laid down his arms?
Yeah, basically he was called up. He was a farmer. He was called up to lead Rome like 300 BC in a great battle. And then he was a dictator. And after he was done with, he laid it down and walked away.
Yeah.
It's called the American. George Washington is known as the American whatever. I can't.
Okay, yeah, sure, Thomas, you should.
Yeah. So Rod in his book talks about methods of how not to live by lies, right, in our modern world, and he uses all these examples from people who lived in the Soviet bloc and who lived through communism, and how they Christians who handled living in communism and tried not to try to keep continuing their lives as Christians and not speak lies, right? And so one of those ways was I guess the principal way was to organize in sort of small cells where people would get together and they would pray together, and they would watch movies or do things and have discussions and all these types of things that were physical in nature. I guess the one question that I had after finishing Rod's book was, how applicable are some of these lessons to our present situation? And I know Rod mentions it himself in his book, in the sense that technology has improved greatly since that time, and our situation, our circumstances aren't the same as what those people experienced in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc, in the sense that the control over people and over our lives and in terms of our privacy has increased exponentially since then. So how feasible are some of these things? Like, can we still organize something like a cell like that without it being, let's say, compromised or something? I guess that comes in the question that comes into place, like, how bad would it get here, right? Because Rod says, because it's a type of soft totalitarianism, it's a different dynamic that's in play. But still, when you talk about maybe losing your job or something like that, I can imagine that it must be more difficult now to organize something like that without, let's say, being caught or having any repercussions, or mitigating those what do you call, mitigating the risks that you're taking, right? So I don't know how you saw that when you read the book, and maybe Matt can pitch in as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think from my perspective, again, I will look at it in terms of, say, classical education. So I think I look to America quite favorably for what they've done in classical education and homeschooling and different homeschooling cooperatives and everything. I think whenever the differences are recognized, I guess that'll be the thing too, but recognizing how distinct the Christian message is versus this modern secularism, going back to those previous points about the statist kind of hegemony of schools, that they teach them that that's neutral. I think we need to dispel the illusion, as it were, that the state is a neutral actor, and that they have this innate right to teach your children and so on. This is something Dr. Casey brought up there whenever I spoke with him the other day, that he used to teach his students at UCD in Dublin whenever he was teaching philosophy, that he tried to cultivate a sense of historical imagination, that he would say, if you look back to history, so you look to the Middle Ages, they could not have imagined a society without kings and dukes and so on, and this is the way things were, and they would have thought that this is the way things almost must be, and so forth. But yet here we are, and we can look back and think, oh, how strange that was now. But people don't take the next logical step, which is to call into question your own social imaginary and ask about, why are things this way, and need they be this way, and so forth. So we have that central story and central identity that Matt's talking about, that we need to be converted to, and constantly call out our modernist and postmodernist assumptions about identity, and about what we think the good life is, and so on. So if we can set up separate institutions like schools, even if that's homeschooling or cooperatives or whatever it is, I think that would be good. But you do run up against challenges, those ones you mentioned, and then how schools are judged by say getting into universities and everything. People will think we'll not be able to get into university if we go down this route, and we're going to be antisocial and everything. So they have to have their sense converted about what it means to be social. Whenever we look to the modern madness and campuses and stuff, I think we can see that that's antisocial behavior. You don't want to be conditioned into a society where that's considered the normal. I think that's part of why I find Kanye so interested in this food and things that you talk about, Thomas, where they expose the insanity. They're considered insane, but they expose the insanity of the world and take us back to where we should be. So I think if we can play on that and then set up alternative institutions like homeschooling and cooperatives and even classical schools, I would love to set up a classical school. I think that would be a big help, just from my own perspective, if that makes sense. And I don't know if Matt would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think from Thomas's original point, we were talking about cells and small groups, like you were talking about homeschooling and cooperatives and things like that, bringing in this to fight this soft totalitarianism. And that's what he was talking about. They fought and helped to obviously you're referring in the book that basically that this is what they did to fight the Soviets, right? That they came together and the church remained strong because they had these small groups. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. But it's not necessarily like that they actively fought the Soviets this way, but it's more like they kept their own identity from being destroyed by the Soviets, and doing so in the long term, I guess it helped, flip their world back, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they had the candlelight revolution or something like that. I don't know exactly, candlelight protest, I think it was called in Czechoslovakia, I think, and that was one of the big Christian sort of protests that happened at the end in the late 1980s, and that helped overthrow their Soviet or their communist government.
Chuck Colson had a book called How Now Shall We Live, and it was Nancy Pearcey. You know Nancy Pearcey. And anyway, so How Now Shall We Live? I think they talked about some of the things in that book in terms of how communism was overcome by this kind of coming together. But just like I was listening to Heidegger, some lectures on Heidegger this morning. We're going to talk about hidden life, so I was like, I'll refresh a little bit. And so with Malick being a Heidegger fan and obviously disciple, and one of the things he says, it's not language, it's discourse. That basically there is something, and we're not just going to teach a language, but someone to learn a language needs to be involved in a discourse. We need to be actively not just teaching people what to think, but that they need to also be actively working that out by sharing it back. So in essence, to have kind of this strong sense of identity, you don't need to just have this sense of I'm separate from the world, I'm distinct from the world, but you need to have a place, a world in which to share that identity. And if you have the larger culture and the culture has this identity, that world that you're gonna, the identity you're obviously going to start sharing is the one with the larger culture. So the larger culture has this power over us in a way that we simply just imbibe, because this is what we regurgitate back. If I go into my workplace, like I was a corrections deputy, I'm not really allowed to share my faith, but I can walk out there and share the secular culture's faith, what they believe. And in that sense, I capitulate or give over my self-understanding to give a little bit of that to them. So there's a space in which I can share an identity, but it's not necessarily the identity that I hold and feel is most valuable or the most core part of me.
Right.
In our church, for when I grew up, we did have these small groups. So we would have small groups, not just in the church, but prayer groups and everything like that, in which people could not just learn, but discuss, talk, share, tell stories. Because a story that's learned is not necessarily a story that's known. It's simply, you've got to regurgitate that. The story that you find in the Bible, you need to go, well, there's that place in the Bible that says X. Well, this is what I think it means. You bring that forward. Well, regurgitating, in the act of regurgitating, in the act of teaching others by this discourse, you're actually becoming more strong in your identity, your self-understanding. So that is true. I mean, and you think about it, where is the strongest sense of identity among that's really changing our culture right now? It's in the universities, because we have spending all this money to put people in these very in-depth discussion groups that they're simply regurgitating this stuff back to themselves. They're talking and they form this identity, and that identity is going out and radically altering the world around us. So I think you're right that small groups are the key, building these communities of not just, so we're someone, we have church, and this is what the problem with church is. We come into a church service and people just teach something, but it doesn't affect the heart until it becomes something that people teach back. It needs to be recursive. It needs to be in some sense a discourse, a shared sense of understanding. Language that is simply known is not necessarily something which is important. Like I know Greek, but I never use it because I was like, it's not something I share with anyone. I know a little bit of it, but that's it. So
I think too that something, I think Rod might touch upon this in the book, and also his conversion to to something like Orthodox Christianity speaks to this as well. So you have to make a conscious decision, I suspect, to adopt some form of ascetism, as we might call it. So especially in this internet age, whenever we're saturated with technology and our smartphones are forming us in these ritual patterns and everything every day, and so how easy it is to access pornography and everything, even for young people, that Rod talks about in the book, that adults Christian adults are going to have to lead by example and say having even basic simple things like screen time and everything, time set aside each day where we have those meaningful conversations and close intimate communion rather than living in this kind of cerebral internet age and so forth, if that makes sense.
I think that reminds me of what I was going to also say about Thomas when he says that if there's some kind of totalitarian thing that's ripping or going to stop us from having these small groups. And I don't think that there's anything, obviously, because it's soft totalitarianism, there's nobody saying we can't get together and share like we're doing right now. The problem is that the internet and entertainment and sheer magnitude of everybody else telling a story tells us it's not worthwhile to do because we get bored doing it. So like church on Sunday, when I grew up, we had church on Sunday night, which was the time where we more or less shared or had discourse and stuff like that. But that went away like in the early 2000s when, you had the internet starting, you had movies, you had television, you had many stuff going on, and people just were like, well, I got stuff going on, and people just seem to be too busy.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like they had anything significant going on. It just was the options for entertainment were increased. And I think that's what ultimately robs us of the power to overcome culture, because we simply just capitulate and allow people, we don't want to sit on the front porch and drink an iced tea and talk anymore. So
the amount of distraction I guess in the last 5 years or so has increased exponentially, just so much. I even noticed it in my own life as well. Even when I get up in the morning, my alarm is on my phone, and I'll catch myself going to Twitter sometimes, like almost immediately. But then I have to catch myself, like I can't go on Twitter. I can't go on Facebook. Like the only thing I can do is check my messages because my fiance might have messaged me. That's the only thing. But then it's very difficult because once you go into that, you immediately start your day off on a note of distraction, right? You're scrolling, you're trying to getting that dopamine high basically of going through social media and your messages and stuff like that. And so and that's what I was mentioning earlier, I guess, especially for younger kids who are now growing up in a completely digital age and with social media. And I've tutored kids that are like 4 years old, 5 years old, who are on iPads and they're watching YouTube, and they're already sucked into the algorithm basically, and they just keep going next video, whatever YouTube basically feeds to them. And so you can tell that attention spans and things like these are going down. And my fiance is a teacher herself, and she, like, even for her, she has to make her lessons so like entertaining, and she goes like all out on her lessons to make them as engaging as possible, because they simply cannot. They don't have attention span. Like some of them do, of course, but like for sure this has changed enormously even since like I was in high school, which wasn't even that long ago, and they can't even watch like she put on a TED Talk, which are supposed to be these very condensed, like entertaining 5 to 10 minute videos, right? And they couldn't watch it. They couldn't. That was too long. They said it's 10 minutes. I need to do something else. And so this is very this is difficult for, especially if you're talking about like church competing against like the nonstop flow of entertainment and things to sort of hit that dopamine high, and there's the new thing, and there's always something that is more interesting than going over the same story and all this sort of stuff, which really puts, I guess, a burden on storytellers that are Christian and I guess pastors as well to up their game and somehow manage to try to reach these new audiences. And so I think there's definitely a couple of figures like Jordan Peterson, for instance, now, and Jonathan Pajot is doing, and Bishop Barron, that are managing to reach younger audiences as well. So for sure there's a flip, because I feel like it's just unsustainable in the long term. So either these kids who grow up in this way, and especially the young college students who are going to university, they either end up feeling very lost in a sort of this confused postmodern world, and they either go very ideological and like they might go certain ways that are very extreme, and some then they might have an intuition or something, and they see someone like Jordan Peterson, especially I think when it comes to men, and that might put them on the right path. But it's part of that is luck, I feel like, and maybe your as well, how you're inclined just to country. There's this, I don't know if you have that in the US as well. I've talked about it with Mark. There's this history canon timeline that we use. It's basically made by the government, who they make this timeline with the most important the most important historical figures, Dutch historic national figures, and events that happened from like the prehistoric age until like now, but it's all focused on the Netherlands basically, right? And so there's like maybe like 30 things or something on it, maybe more on a time of like very, very short description, and you're supposed to sort of use that as a frame of reference for teaching history.
Yeah.
What it comes down to is basically it's a type of what they call a Whig history, which is like a sort of secular, sort of progressivist history, where it's like this inevitable progress towards more freedom and more liberty and sort of enlightenment values.
It has a narrative.
So they pick certain things from history, right? And that's the official history of the Netherlands. That's our story, right? But what we notice now, it's interesting because I had to learn it as well. I always find it dreadfully boring because it's a lot of like dates and stuff and just random names, and it didn't really feel all that connected, right? It kind of felt a bit random, but that was the story that we had. And so what was interesting now, they recently updated it this past year. And they had a promotion video for it on YouTube. And I talked about this with Mark, and it's this super woke commercial that's promoting this type of modernist, I guess, timeline, this canon. But it's basically all these Zoomers that are like walking around and they're super like sassy and stuff, and there's this voiceover in the background saying, "This is your history. You can make your own meaning," and blah blah blah. And they point the camera to a bunch of like famous characters in Dutch history and painting and stuff, and like, this is what you've been told, and this is what you've been told, but no, this is your world. And then there's this like a sassy lady who pushes away these men, and then the video ends with her standing on like, what do you call those things? The sort of like the pillars on top of which you have the Greek and the Roman statues of the gods. And so instead of the statue, you would have this woman standing on top of her, and it's just like, this is your story, blah blah, and make history, or something like that, right? Or like take your own destiny in your own hands. Something that's basically the message. Like, this is your history, your meaning, and take your own destiny. And it's basically this whole, it's saying like the whole history that you're taught is bullshit, and you can do whatever you want, and this you have to take control and not be, hampered by the glass ceiling or whatever it is. And but then the ironic thing is that it's promoting this cookie cutter history from the government that's saying this is the history of the Netherlands. So there's this very weird dichotomy, where there's this marriage between these two worldviews that don't match up at all, but somehow they're still being promoted at the same time. But you can tell that this new one that's being promoted on YouTube, this is what's going to eventually just eat up that old story that we've been taught, like even when I was in high school, right? Because you can tell like they added some additions to it. And the newest one is that they made it a bit more woke, but it's still like very sort of, I don't know, it's a sort of neoliberal type of modernist timeline. But the last thing they added was what they call the orange feeling, which is, I guess, is the type of sort of PC type of patriotism that we feel in the Netherlands when the Dutch team plays soccer. So that's when we feel a type of identity, I guess. That's the closest thing that we can get to that. This is the newest thing. So this is, I guess, to me, this is how you could tell how weak, I guess, our national identity is, our story is, that we can't come up with anything better. It's also like a very strange thing. It's like, you can't really call it a historic figure or place in time. It's very, it's not really well defined. So, but the thing is, I guess, the Netherlands might be a bit behind on this whole culture war compared to America, where only now we're seeing the effects of I guess, the type of woke culture eating up the old sort of neoliberal or liberal story, which it cannot do anything to hold that back. I feel like there's nothing really it can do to provide a counter narrative to that is strong enough to provide an alternative. And the problem is, what I was getting to is that what Rod talks about in the book as well is that you're creating, that these new kids are already distracted by all the new media on the internet and all these other like principalities, I guess, that are being atomized or demoralized, in a sense that we're basically saying you're all like these individuals that don't really have any connection to anyone else, but it's your story, your truth, all these types of things. You're not really connected to any higher story or any other commitment besides what you want to do and what makes you feel happy. So because they're then isolated, what Rod talks about in the book as well, this makes them very vulnerable to all kinds of, weird principalities and other ideologies that provides them with a type of meaning, because they have to come together in some way, because it's unsustainable to live in that manner, right?
Mhm.
Unless you go full nihilist, I guess. It's just, and I think this is the difficult part as well with the public schools, and I guess especially in the US, that this is going, they're saying that this is a type of neutral way of looking at the world, but it's not, and it's increasingly not apparent that that's not the case. So this is, I guess, the point that I was trying to make earlier, where I'm worried what's going to happen with the Zoomer generation, the Generation Z as well, and not even just with the millennials, but, and I guess whatever comes after, that'll be increasingly difficult for them to if they don't have, I guess, a family that grounds them in their identity, that they might be more susceptible to all kinds of strange things, right? So yeah, I don't know exactly where I was going to go eventually with that, but I don't even know how it started. But these are things, I guess, that really struck me from Rod's book, and I guess that get to the essence of things.
Where we're talking about neo-Marxism and versus the old Marxism. In old Marxism seemed to be more about economics and not necessarily about class structure. I mean, there was a bourgeois, how do you say it? Can't even say the word, but basically the higher ups and the lower downs. You know, basically that we had the two main classes at war with each other. So it's about economics, but now with the advent of postmodernism and everything like that, basically critical theory in every respect, that basically it's not just about economics, it's about every stratification. It's about basically what Jordan Peterson talks about in terms of structure, in terms of hierarchies. That basically that this is not natural, and that we should overcome all hierarchies. That basically the whole intent is to eradicate all these things. But he says that's just bunk. I mean, it's like the lobster. You look at the lobster, like 30 million, it still is hierarchical, and you're going to find these. And it seems to me that's exactly what's taking place, that in this postmodern, which you were just referring to too, this postmodernism, which is you were really keying in on the idea that the illogic, the fallacy at the heart of it, which is to say that postmodernism is an attack on all meta narratives. That basically there are no meta narratives. We all are individuals, and we can have that. The problem is that itself is a meta narrative. So it's the like the only truth is there is no absolute truth. Well, that's an absolute truth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this whole thing is very odd. But you see increasingly, like you were referring to, you see increasingly that this idea of, like, I don't know if you listened to Rubin on the Rubin Report at all here in the United States, but basically this push towards, with Jordan Peterson and everything like that, push back towards classical liberalism, and basically saying that we can have a discourse, we can have a discussion, we have the right to be wrong, and we can have freedom of expression and freedom of thought. But because you see the new progressive movement, which is shocked these old classical liberals, that they're now saying no. I mean, basically that this was always about having power, having control, and we're going to be the ones in control. And you're like going, wait, I thought this whole thing was about, and really, I think they're just more shocked by is that it was always about this idea that we can all just have our own disagreements. Is all just about fair and freedom. It was never about fair and freedom. It was merely about undermining the foundations of the old world in order to create a new and establish those as the one thing that's going to have bearing on everybody. That's it's so amazing to me. And the more I see that, I'm like going, well, why would I have given up the, old classic Christian worldview, Catholicism and everything like that, where we had this one strong meta narrative that was going down through 2,000 years of history. And I'm like, you worshiped a savior, you valued a savior who was himself Lord of all, but humbled himself to become underneath. And you're like, that's a beautiful story that tells us how we should treat each other, right? Why would I give up that story for your story? If that's a great story, I'm like, that should be everyone's meta narrative. And now you want to create a new meta narrative, which I don't agree with at all. So if this was always about you having power, I'd rather go back to the Catholic Church having power or some other story having power rather than you having that power. And I think that people's eyes are being awoken to that basically these boys, these young kids that watch Jordan Peterson, they're recognizing that this is a load of garbage I've been given. And really it was all about taking power away from me. that basically I had something and then you took it away. Why wouldn't I choose that over this? That basically it was always about someone else having power, not about the oppressed rising up. It was about someone else having power. So anyway, I don't know. I just
Yeah.
on and
Yeah.
on about that.
Yeah, I think,
I think yeah. Go ahead.
Thomas?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I think that speaks to the point that I think a number of people have mentioned recently. So you said about Reuben there, he talks about now learning from Jordan that underneath the logos, you have to have the mythos and so on. So that makes perfect sense to me. I don't see why one would accept the notions of people like Steven Pinker, Dawkins, and New Atheists. I think there's a greater honesty to people like Nietzsche who have seen stared into the abyss and not receded back to this kind of historical naivete and desire to maintain the kind of Judeo-Christian ideas and pretend that they make sense within a purely materialist Darwinian worldview. Whenever you have everything is the product of chance, time, and so forth coming together, blind matter with no goal. So you've got human beings that in line with what Nietzsche would talk about, you have the human will. It doesn't come from anywhere that we have to bind ourselves to, and it doesn't have a direction that we have to bind ourselves to. You don't have the kingdom of God. You don't have the creator who is outside of creation and time, matter, and space that imbues the creation with an order that people should bind themselves to and that calls it good and so forth. So it makes sense in line with what you're saying that you would have these competing identities focused on power, that the greatest power player will win at the end of the day. And as far as I can see, at least in terms of modern history, the modern nation state has been the biggest power player for some of the reasons we mentioned and more, and the ability to go and I guess this touches upon hidden life, to bind people to an ideology that would involve them killing other people and sacrificing their own lives and everything else for, say, Nazi Germany, same for the other totalitarian regimes, say Russia that Rod talks about in the book and so forth. So the only other thing might be something like a world state or some transnational body that would still be focused on power because it can't call upon an intelligible order that is beyond the human mind. I think that's the failure of people like Kant originally, and then these later new atheists who think that the human mind is the greatest thing, and then morphed into the greatest, the will, whoever has the will, the power, whoever has the power decides what is right or might makes right, and so on. Does that make sense? And do you have anything to add to that there, or
I think it's just bringing up all that stuff. I think it's interesting that with all these different competing ideologies and stuff seeking for power, seeking to have control, it seems to me that we have entered into the closest thing to the classical pagan world than we've ever had before, with all the competing gods and different loci of power, and like this guy, this magistrate, or this this temple, or this and everybody seemed to be like more or less just kind of like that was the state of being. It was a state of everybody. You had Rome over all of it, but allowing for this panoplia of differing competing ideas. Panoplia. Anyway.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, panoply. I think that's right. So yeah, I think if I wasn't a Christian, so I became a Christian like 7 years ago, and kind of tried as much as I could anyway to interrogate different worldviews and everything. And I can understand people maybe going to Islam or something like that, because then you have a revealed transcendent God who in that case, his will is elevated above all things. There's a kind of voluntarism within Islam that I think is a problem, and in contrast with our notion of God as Father and so forth, so that we can form a relationship with him and have we have the Trinity, obviously, who speaks to God's nature as he is both the one and the many, and that allows for the order of the world to be expressed similarly, so we can partake in that in our marriages and stuff, and we become more who we are through our sacrifices and imitation and participation in Christ, and how we love one another. That's our identity. We become more as we act that love out, rather than this kind of individualist, expressive individualism that says my desires are who I am. And we see that in critical theory too, that usually, and the sexual revolution especially, as Scott Yenor said, things like that, that you're identified with your desires. So then people perceive themselves to be targeted. You're like even built into the language whenever they say you're a target, your hate speech is like targeting my identity and everything, because you critique their desires and how they want to live those desires out. And that liberal model doesn't have a sufficient base to criticize those people, and I think is swallowed up by the tide of history. That what do you call him? Jerome, who only talks about this too, that Marxism gives people that sense of identity. And it's hard because people don't live out the logic of their own conclusions. So they believe these meta narratives without realizing they're meta narratives and so forth. And then it does give them something to do. So rather than just sitting around playing video games in their basement or whatever, they want to go and find that meaning and these ritual marches and so forth. So you can understand the appeal and the ultimate kind of pathos of the older classical liberal kind of worldview. And the way Scott talks about it is that it serves as a delivery system for the ideas of the hard left, so that it's just a trajectory towards doom, really. I think it speaks to the hidden life whenever it goes into the train, where he has the dream of the train in A Hidden Life, and history is going to go a certain direction if we accept these presuppositions, and you are going to end up with Hitler or this strong central authority. And whereas then it contrasts that in the imagery of the movie, if I'm reading it right, with the stream. So it uses that kind of, I would suspect, for the Holy Spirit, in the stream of living water, which is sending us in a different trajectory through history and beyond history itself. And I think from my own perspective, obviously, I think that Christ actually rose from the dead, and it's true and not just a useful myth or a useful fiction or whatever that people are trying to appropriate in with the Christian faith. So Peterson or someone like that might try and put it into Darwinian terms, and it's long term, but it's still the product of human mind rather than a divine revelation or whatever. Whereas I think this is, number one, true, and number two, a better story than those kind of critical theory stories or whatever, because they set up as the good life, maybe having 6 people from black or whatever homosexual or transgender backgrounds on the list of people to win an Oscar and stuff like that, whereas we have a much better story, and people are called to go out of their way to love one another in marriages and their societies. And you have, like Pajot talks about with the fractal patterns, that it's built into reality itself, and it plays it out at all these different levels of being. And that's a much better story, the greatest story ever told, than this kind of either of those two dominant alternatives, if that makes sense.
I want to pick, I think you touched on something that just sparked something in me about hidden life, about and how this all relates, and to basically our forming of identity and keeping a strong sense of self, even in midst of the totalitarianism that finds in our midst. And that basically, in essence, what the hidden life is that someone can stand up and say no, and no, for no better purpose than simply to say no. I mean, there was no like political aspect to it. He's not like starting a whole new agenda. He's just saying something that's wrong and saying, I'm not going to participate. And but that key scene with when he goes inside the church, he meets the Catholic priest outside the church, but he goes inside the church and he meets the icon painter. And the icon painter talks about his activity of painting the saints. And you can't help but know that he's referring, that it's Malick, who is the icon painter, painting the story of this guy who has had a hidden life. He's the icon painter who's offering something to somebody in the world who might see this, who has never seen this before, this hidden life, this person who did no extraordinary thing other than to say no. And he's offering this as a way of, and I love how he does it in terms of the feeling, not in terms of the thought, but in the terms of the feeling of a life that one could have, of being something rather than simply having to do something, having to make something, having to do something original, having to be originally creative, but simply to say no and be significant in that. And simply be a farmer or whatever, to live a life, to have children, to live a hidden life. And I can't help but think of all of the, Christianity has prized these saints who have had these, we look at the saints and we say, look what they did. They did some great, extraordinary things. They're heroes of the faith. We look at Jesus and we look what he did. But you obviously, he referenced the way of the cross over and over and over again in the film, showing little signs, and even to the point of having the wagon thing coming down in front of the screen, and it's in the shape of a cross. I mean, he constantly reminds you that the way of the cross was a hidden life, that Jesus was nothing during his life, that he was nothing during his life, and that everyone saw him having and being nothing. And I think that hidden life, which Malick brings to our forefront and says that this is the way of the cross, this is what it means to be a Christian, is to live this hidden life, to be in the closet, to be in prayer, to do these things which don't seem extraordinary at all in the moment, but may have an eternal impact in some other way.
Yeah, in line, I think, too, with what you're saying there, Matt. I think you mentioned Heidegger and his work on Heidegger previously. I believe, too, he was meant to do his master's thesis on a couple of people, but one of them was Kierkegaard. It was Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein, a few others, maybe Heidegger as well. But that seems to be that idea that the painter is speaking about there, of being more than just an admirer of Christ and actually living it out existentially or whatever, seems to come from Kierkegaard. And I think that is beautiful and convicting too, for someone like myself. So, like, nominally I've been Christian for 7 years, but I don't live up to the goal, as it were, and find myself sort of living by the patterns of the secularist culture and so on, that you do have to have that constant tension, and God's pulling you out of that life of mediocrity and everything. So I thought that was really interesting as well.
Yeah.
Beyond that, if you want to add anything to that, Thomas?
I think it what Matt was saying, just to go back on that, is that Malick shows you, I guess, the way of the cross, but in the same way, it's also a critique of I guess Christianity, of a certain type of Christianity that Rod talks about as well, which he calls it, or I think he referenced someone else who calls it the sort of therapeutic Christianity or something like that. So, sorry, what was I saying? Well, but the therapeutic Christianity, because he says, right, that Eichencarver says something, we have admirers here, but not followers, or something like that. And I think it ties in as well to what you're saying, that the church as well in Christianity in the modern age at least might have been ceding ground, I guess, to the culture, to the secular culture, in the sense that some of, I'm not saying everything, but like some of it might be too focused on, or at least people might interpret it as being a sort of feel good religion, like everything, if you hear the good news about Jesus, then it's all good, and it's a type of people who go to church to feel good about being Christian, but don't actually live it out themselves. They just like, like hearing the message, and how that is co-opted, I guess, by the liberal ideology of freedom and being yourself and personal happiness. And this is the type of Christianity that you might like when things are going well. And I think C.S. Lewis talks about this as well, that when things are going well, this is all great, but once any difficulty comes across your way, then that this is not going to you're not going to sustain it. You're going to drop it right off the bat. So I think that's also a big part of the hidden life, is showing the viewer, how far Franz is willing to go and how far he's willing to suffer. But it's also asking, the viewer, the question is constantly asking you, like, why is he doing this? Because he's going, as you mentioned, he's going so far, and really he has every reason to just say yes, right? Because he can work as a medic or something like that. He doesn't even have to shoot anyone. So there's the question of like, is this right for his family, and what is he going to achieve with this? And I think it's a difficult question as well for Christians, but it's confronting because it really destroys that I guess diluted Christian message of mediocrity, I guess, where you don't really have to bear your cross or something like that. Like, I guess what if you're a Christian, you actually have to do these things, or otherwise you're not really, doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I think that's that focus on suffering and being willing to bear your cross, and not just in the sense that he gets tortured and all of that, but also I guess going through the motions of their regular life and the difficulty of working the land, I guess, is also a type of a symbol or metaphor for their spiritual, the toughness of their spiritual journey. But it does lend to a certain grace, I guess, or a certain dignity, which you continually find in the movie. Even when Francis is being tortured, when he's in prison, there's always a sense of beauty in his suffering as well, which he finds in it as well. And I think it's very, I don't know, it's, I guess, what I like about Malick is that he doesn't make it too, it's not like that Franz talks about, or he doesn't really say exactly why he's doing what he's doing. And you wouldn't expect him to, because he's a farmer, right? He's no academic. He probably doesn't even know exactly what he's, why he's doing what he's doing. Yeah. It's like what you said, you don't have to be an academic, you just have to relive that story over and over again, and know the Bible and all of that stuff. And I guess that is someone that Franz must have been as a farmer. I guess he intuitively knows that this is the right thing to do, but he probably doesn't have the words as well to really explain why it is that he's doing it. And I guess it shows again how important it is to participate in that, and truly participate in the sense that you also really live it out. Even if you don't really, fully understand it, and a theologian or something like that. And I think that I think that's one of the messages, I guess, of the film as well.
If you think in terms of Heidegger, I was watching this morning, in terms of inauthenticity versus being authentic, and obviously that comes across very much in Hans's case, is by continuing to go the way that he goes, he's living authentically, even if he doesn't quite understand why he is doing what he is doing. He's certainly living authentically, and I think that's what Malick sees and prizes in Franz, that he's an authentic human being doing. He's not false, and it seems that everybody else, by capitulating, by hiding, by not speaking the truth, by not speaking how they truly feel, are living inauthentically. They're simply going along with the flow. And it seems that Franz is so extraordinary. His case, in terms of Malick looking at him, seems to be so extraordinary because he is unique in the fact that he remains true to himself, even though it doesn't do any ultimate, or he doesn't see it doing ultimate good.
Yeah, well, not in his own life, right? But and I guess, and then you also see the contrast with the people that he talks to, and that interrogate him on why he's doing what he's doing. There's that scene, which I think is one of the best scenes of the movie, with the guy who plays Bruno Ganz, the guy who plays Hitler in Downfall, and he's I guess one of the judges, right? And then there's this scene after he talks with him where he basically has this sort of mental breakdown almost, where I think he realizes that what Franz is doing is right, and that he was a Christian himself, or he must have known, right? He's someone who gets sort of slipped into the Nazi hierarchy, but he's probably not someone who was like a full-on Nazi, right? But he kind of eased into that very slowly and lost himself in that way. And I guess in that scene you really see how much his soul is tortured, right? Because he's living a false life in a sense, and whereas it's contrast with Franz, even though he's physically tortured or physically imprisoned, he is mentally free in that sense. So it's interesting, but the thing, I guess, how do you then deal with the fact that if you're talking about Heidegger and living an authentic life, how do you deal with actual Nazis who are living in, I guess, an authentic life because they truly believe the things that they believe, right? Aren't they also then living an authentic life? I think I don't know exactly. I don't know enough about Heidegger to really speak on that.
I don't think in that respect, Malick is is praising Heidegger, his thoughts in that respect. I think he definitely brings to Heidegger a sense of Christianity. I think he's definitely bringing that there is something to be prized over. Heidegger is basically almost like a postmodernist in that respect. That basically existence precedes essence. That we are thrown into the world and we have to interpret ourselves. That we have no foundation to us, and we're simply just trying to figure out how things as they go. And in that sense, he speaks something true of life, something true that we find to be true, equally true among us all. But I think Malick brings to it this unique prize and portrait of seeing it in a Christian way, or more of a Kierkegaardian way. So,
right, yeah, it's a bit of a mix, I guess. There's one thing. Sorry, it was crapping out earlier, so I couldn't pitch in on it. But there was one thing that I wanted to add when you mentioned that this. The critical theory and I guess the present day climate, societal climate, it has a lot of the sort of pagan feel to it, and that reminded me to go back to that video I talked about earlier about that history, the canon. When this it's really a symbolism happens moment, because when you have that image of that girl standing on top of that what would be a statue of a Roman god or a Greek god, really shows, I guess, also the weird pagan influences that are part of the sort of critical theory worldview. And I hadn't thought of it before, but now it sort of clicks. And it reminds me of what René Girard talked about in this book about, you know, the critical theory. People say that there is no meta narrative, but actually we talked about is how actually this is a very strong meta narrative that is very much competing with Christianity in a way, because it does take that concern for victims to a sort of ultimate extreme, but then it also, you know, pinpoints the people that are the oppressors, and they need to be, you know, done away with, or they have to be taken out of power in order for you know the victims to be freed or whatever, to be lifted up. And so recently there was a picture posted to I think the Black Lives Matter Instagram or something, one of these groups or something, a very, very big Instagram account, which was like a very horrific painting of like this obese black lady holding the head of like I think, Mark, I showed it to you, the severed head of like some white guy or something like that, or a white woman or something. Very horrific painting. And the way it was supposed to be as horrific as possible, even like how the woman looks, and she's obese, and like all the vulgarities of the body are shown. So it's very much meant to be sort of a provocative type of painting. But I think that really shows also the pagan influence, how it comes down to human sacrifice, in the sense that you know, the oppressor figure needs to be dealt away for this sort of catharsis, or this to come through. And so that's really pagan in its origins, and that's what Girard shows as well, where it sort of co-opts this new neo-paganism, I guess, or critical theory, co-opts parts of Christianity, but sort of weirdly subverts it into a sort of neo-paganism, which is very dangerous. But it's not. It's just weird how they claim to not have this meta narrative, but I guess maybe that's no longer the case, maybe on an individual level. But I guess on an individual level, it's like I can do whatever I want, but also they're part of this very closed system, right? Yeah. Anyway, so that's just one I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, that's really good. I think alongside Gerard too, you have Ivan Illich, who I've mentioned, I think, to you before, and this notion in his work of the corruption of Christianity and the Antichrist even. So he understands this kind of Antichrist to be playing out along the lines of what Thomas was just saying, that they will co-opt the language and different things of the Christian faith and then use them for ill and even well-intentioned. So I think Peugeot's video he did about 666, and obviously in the Bible, the number 7 has that sense of perfection and so on. So it's just fallen short of perfection, but yet it's so far from Christian truth. It is Antichrist. And even in the Middle Ages, I think in Bernard McGinn's book, on the cover, you see the Christ figure and then the little Antichrist with small horns. He even depicted it with small horns to get across artistically the notion that it's difficult to differentiate between the two. And I think this is part of the problem, because one of the great Christian communities in America, for example, it seems to me, is the African American community. So they had that double history of America living out the life of Exodus with 1776 and coming to freedom and so on, but they also had it in emancipation from slavery. So they had that narrative that saw themselves within the Christian story. But now it seems to be that African Americans, because they go to public schools and so on, and they've no choice, and the conditions are so rotten for many of them in inner cities and so forth, that they've no choice, unfortunately. They go to these schools, these government schools, and then get hypnotized from a young age into this alternative religion, and have their identity kind of ripped from them, and they're given this lesser, what I would call like an antichrist identity. And I think that's tragic for the church. It's tragic for the church generally, but just watching that, seeing that play out, I think even within a generation, is like my own country in Ireland, that we had our strong Christian traditions, and we had our own struggles with getting civil rights and all. So I'm from Northern Ireland, where like my mum's generation and all didn't have civil rights, and until the late 60s, like after Dr. King and people like that in America. And yet they had, even in spite of those hard sociological conditions, and that there was like genuine systemic oppression or whatever, that they had this Christian identity that they saw beyond that there. But now people are being robbed of that, and I guess too, they're giving themselves over to it. I guess as the Bible talks about, that you become those it sounds like an awful thing to call people like antichrist, but you pervert the gospel out of such it's so well intentioned, but you're perverting the gospel, and you're dividing people in line with what Thomas is saying into black and white. And you have in Girard the scapegoat mechanism, and that seems to be the case within antiquity all right up to the present, and how we, I guess, horizontally scapegoat people. So you see that in the scapegoating of Trump, and notably like African Americans, and like Trump has his problems and all, but notably like what was the percentage of African Americans that voted for Trump, but yet they'll vote for Biden because he's so well intentioned, and Kamala, and they're offering this vision that they're the good guys against this cliche bad guy. It's like a scapegoating mechanism. And then I think also you've got the scapegoating mechanism playing out in the sense of history. So now you look back, and it's the white male group is the scapegoat and the ultimate evil in history. And we see this in post-colonial theory, and as if that is the center of history. And you see this in James Cone and people like that, the African-American theologian, who will use the Marxist terms and present that as Christian. And he sees like the black figure and the noose and all these things as the central symbols of history, rather than Christ and his resurrection and everything. And people read that and they think, oh, wow, this is a powerful Christian message. This is what it means to be radical. But no, that's not what it means to be radical. Christ was much more radical than that. That's a Marxist appropriation that tries to kind of suck us down to the material conditions and pit us against one another, rather than preaching Christ's message of love that would provide the world with more people like Franz and the characters you mentioned in Rod's book as well, if that makes sense. Is there anything?
I think it's, you're talking about the African American church, going back to that a little bit, and talking about how they wouldn't vote for Trump, but they would vote for Biden. I've been talking to my boys about this idea, and I think it goes back to the heart of what we're all talking about. But that my boys have really become very conservative, and they're more conservative than I have. And I'm like sometimes cautioning them to say, hey, let's look at it from a different point of view, because the reaction is that when you get locked into a worldview, you sit there say is that if anybody does the other person does that, they're stupid. Like, for instance, the African American people, and I'm not saying you were doing this, Tom. I mean, Marcus, but that the African Americans wouldn't vote for Trump, but they would vote for Biden. And I just think that goes to show how much. And it's not one thing. We don't choose one thing because it's easy to choose. Our belief system, our whole thought life, is an interconnected web of ideas. Things that we like and dislike, things that we, are pro, things that we're against. And it's not simply that we're choosing Biden versus Trump, but usually Trump and Biden are bound up with a whole host of other things which you cannot untangle. So in essence, when African Americans say, you say, well, they won't vote for Trump, but they'll vote for Biden. It's like, well, they can only, many of them can only vote for Biden. That would be their only option. They cannot not vote for Biden. And the same goes with many conservatives. They could not vote for somebody else, even though Trump was himself very radical in terms of conservatism. He wasn't a neocon. He came in as somehow, he kind of co-opted some of the conservative elements and kind of refashioned, I think, in essence, remapped the whole board, because now people are going, now we have this nationalism coming in again. Yeah. Whereas traditionally back up into the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, conservatives were globalists. They saw themselves as being for free markets, free trade. And here comes Trump saying, no, we're going to clamp down everything. My point is that this is why story is important, because having the right story and having the story that we do, options are going to be off the table for us. Certain options will be off the table for us because our story will define us in the way that we should be. I'm not so sure that quite addresses what you were talking about, but I just think that fundamentally underlying everything is the web of meaning, the map of meaning that Jordan Peterson refers to in his book. That idea that all of our thoughts, all of our ideas come together, and it's hard for us to disentangle that from other people in the way that they see the world. Yeah. So it's small things, small victories here over time. It's not one triumph, one victory that's going to win the war. It's going to be over time, this slow incursion into people who formerly hadn't seen it the way before. I have a friend of mine, I'll just close with this in terms of what I was saying, but I have a friend of mine who he just had a baby. First baby's 40 years old, and his baby's now in a critical care. She was malformed in the womb, and they've been having surgery on her, and she may end up passing away. Hopefully not. We're praying for her. And I think that she may end up living. So it's kind of just all up in the air right now, and they're on pins and needles. But we've been praying for him, and I've been having a lot of people pray for him. And he shared with me, he was like you. I mean, some of you, he was an atheist, ardent atheist, he was into a bunch of different things. And he's come to a point at the age of 40 of saying, the things that held him back from accepting what he had initially been raised as a Catholic, and he rejected that, became an atheist, and did a lot of different things. But the things that held him back have slowly fallen over time, to where now he's in a place where he can accept something which was formerly completely off bounds for him. Anyway, I just think that we slowly dig away at certain things. We slowly dig away at the story of others. We slowly continue persistently telling our own story. And over time, not with one big move, not with one big slice, but eventually those walls begin to come down.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think certainly there's a flip happening, right, with Jordan Peterson and Jonathan and all these there's more figures, I guess, that are standing up, and certainly the Christian story, even though I guess Christianity is still in decline, at least in the West. I think certainly there's slowly something happening, but it will take a long time before I feel like we'll see the exponential effects of it. But it's quite amazing what's been happening, I guess, in the past few years since Jordan Peterson really stood up, and the whole new atheist movement it's basically done now, right? There's not much of that left. And so certainly we're seeing that happening with Kanye as well, and all these big figures standing up. So it will just take time for sure. But for now, it is difficult, because what Mark was talking about, and I talked with him about this before. My fiance, she's doing her master's program right now, and she's doing a program that focuses on urban schools and urban education, which is mostly minorities, of course. And so one of the books, she had to basically acquaint herself with like the most popular, I guess, what do you call them, like youth books or young adult books right now. So it used to be maybe like Harry Potter or something like that, right? That's not really on there anymore. Like she read the number one book. I can't remember the name. But it was basically, the book I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but the book was about a gay, a black high school student or something in some school who had a bunch of trans friends, and they're all like minorities, and he had like a couple of white people who were like allies or something to him, and the whole story is centered around this high school which is being attacked by the police of the town, or like there's something happens in the school, they install, I think, security, what do you call the security, the gates that you have at the airport, because someone brought in a weapon or something and they think it's oppressive. And anyways, the whole story comes down to the police basically acting as Nazis, and they they execute a bunch of the kids in the school. They straight up execute them, and there's this whole riot, and the whole story is basically about this kid fighting the police, and the story ends with what seemed to be a type of redemption or a coming together of the community, but then it's subverted, and the main character spits on like a police officer who's trying to make amends for what happened or something. And that's basically how the story ends. The story begins with him as a high schooler who doesn't really know his place, especially as a gay black teenager, and then it sort of ends with him as a sort of radical activist who is fighting a system. And this is on the top 5 or something young adult books that these kids are reading. And I was and it's funny because my fiance is like way more liberal than I am. So she doesn't really have as like her radar doesn't really go off or something on a lot of this sort of stuff where it would for me. But it's fine. We talk about this openly, but this, even for her, she was like, I don't know what I'm reading. I don't understand why this is like the number one thing. I don't know why anyone would teach this to these kids. Like but that's, and you can imagine, because this is like what is being taught as well in these urban schools of usually, kids who are not very well off. And this is what you're being taught as your story, right? This is the number one story that they have right now that is popular. It's like that. I just can't imagine like what that does to someone at that age, right? And especially if we grow up in a poor neighborhood like that, like, it's very strange, and that does make me worry about, like, I didn't know it was that bad, but because she's in this, she's in this program, I hear about all these types of things that are happening in these schools, and especially these urban schools. And I can't, these kids have to go up so many roadblocks that it's so difficult, I guess, for them to find any other story than the sort of the victim narrative that they're being pushed. Like, I'm not saying at all that the African American community didn't go through horrific things in the past and all that. And I think it's completely fine to talk about slavery and all these types of things. That's completely fine. But this is something else altogether, right? This is teaching you it's a very subversive and destructive worldview that you're being taught in a very badly told story as well. It's not even good. So that does worry me a little bit. And so, for us as well, who have had, like, all of us have had the opportunity to have a decent education and gone to university, blah, blah, blah. And so we've had a chance as well to connect, at least for me as an atheist, to connect with people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan and stuff. But like for kids in these low income areas, like, I don't really, like, how do they find a path forward? That's almost, that will be, I think, the real battleground with these types of kids that are really in this, they don't have a choice which school they go to as well. And I think that's a dangerous thing. And I think it will take a long time for something like that to change. But yeah, so there's good news and there's bad news, but and I think in the short term it will be mostly bad news, unfortunately. But yeah, we'll have to see. But that really shocked me when I heard her talk about this book, because it almost sounded like it couldn't be real, because it's so preposterous, the story, that it can be real. But it's like one of the number one books. I have to look up what the name is, but I forgot.
Yeah,
go ahead, Marcus.
No, I think I was just going to say that sort of speaks to what I am talking about, that the victimhood ideology takes the center rather than Christ and his victory over sin and death, and how that transfigures people's lives in very practical ways, and it gives them that story that they can do more, even though things have been difficult, that life is about more than that, and they can transcend and overcome. So obviously we shall overcome, Dr. King made famous. But I think too that in line with what Thomas is saying, that there's this Trojan horse too. So one week, as you saw in the way critical theory went mainstream, then week 1, it's like Black Lives Matter. Week 2, what is it? What do you see? Black trans lives matter.
Yeah.
So the Trojan horse of transgender ideology and the shibboleths of the sexual revolution are pushed through this community, and we're all made to feel that because they have been historically victimized and so forth, we do feel a sympathy for African Americans and so forth, even around the world. And I think that speaks to what I'm trying to get across with the notion of the Antichrist, that it manipulates our compassion and our desire for their good and uses that for ill gains, if that makes sense.
It uses the power of what we believe and subverts it in order to destroy it. It's basically deconstructing the whole point of what we believe. It's
deconstructing and reconstructing in these malevolent ways, I guess, if that makes sense. But,
but they keep getting more extreme as well of these stories, or more almost laughably, like almost comical, like how sort of cartoonish these stories are, because, and I think Jonathan talks about this, because they always have to present this story where it's like they're the rebels or whatever, or the oppressed people, and they're fighting this system which is in control, which is in power. But really, because they are gaining so much cultural power right now, and they have so much cultural power, especially in the universities and the school system and all these, even in the government, is that because they're not, the story makes less and less sense. They have to make it more and more extreme for it to sort of to keep participating in it, because it's not like, they have to make it more and more extreme the less real it becomes, in a way. And so this is why it's becoming so almost it's just becoming comical, how weird these stories are becoming, where before it was more, I guess, it was a bit more nuanced, or was less obvious than some of these things right now. But it's because it's a revolutionary type of narrative that they're following, they cannot not be the victims in any type of story, right? So this is their story, so this is how they participate in it. So they have to keep continuing hearing and reading these stories, which are revolutionary stories, where they are the oppressed ones, and then there's someone who they need to, some hierarchy that they need to take down, even though they are becoming increasingly the ones in cultural power and in the real world, which is very strange, because it doesn't really make much sense.
Well, it's funny to me, talking about this 60s cultural revolution, youth rising up to confront their parents, or basically the world at large in which they were born into. And we have this sense in America, and perhaps the Western world, that this is natural, that basically teens that are growing up rebel against their parents. In fact, that's actually not true for the majority of history, that kids don't rebel against their parents. I mean, they might on occasional, but for the most part, they go the way of their parents. They do what their parents have instructed them to do. They simply take that as example. But our narrative of the hippie movement and everything like that has been so defined by that generation, that they define as almost a meta narrative, that this is the way that it always is and always will be, that kids that rebel against their parents, and that's the way it should be, or that's the way we need to accept it to be. It's funny to me, is that's just the story that's being told and keeps being recapitulated. And it's almost like a matter of faith. So
I think
just like sex has become
it is. I think it's exactly like that.
So
I think that's why I have been drawn so much to Kanye West, and Thomas and I have talked about this particularly. And Kanye, because he comes from that culture, and there was no one more kind of outspoken and everything than Kanye. He's in some ways genuinely radical, and would say things whenever it would have been costly for him in the past, about George Bush being racist and everything, whether it's right or wrong, that he was willing to say it on national TV and everything. So he showed he's willing to put skin in the game. And now that the winds have changed, and that many people within his own community, so like as if that's one community, but anyway, that people will turn against him, but he's willing to speak the truth. I think that speaks volumes about him, and I guess in line with the theme of A Hidden Life too, he's willing to forgo that rejection across different levels of society, even those people in the community that were turning on France and so on. But I think even beyond that, in the more positive side, that he has, as someone who kind of grew up now, I know he think he grew up knowing his father, so he talks about his father, is like earthly father, and it's a beautiful relationship that they have. And then he speaks about deep truths now in a kind of ironic way, that he's the foolish character, remind us of these central truths, that he'll speak about abortion being this evil thing and everything whenever it's become the norm for, well, American society in general, and then the African American community who have their children killed disproportionately in that community, and it's sold to them as emancipation. And Kanye speaks out against this and reminds them of our relationship with God the Father, and speaks openly in these really interesting ways about our relationship with Father God, Abba, and everything. And he's leading from his position of like power, cultural power, and everything. But it's the same with the marriage. So I think Glenn Lowry, the great African American scholar, has this model. He distinguishes between that victim narrative, which he does say he gives the devil its due and says there are some things to that are right. But then he argues that we should, like Thomas Sowell, privilege the development model, and that would include things. He had a really interesting conversation with Al Mohler, the Christian theologian, there recently, and they talked about family and things like that. That is the building block of civilization. Like God has revealed and even give us the commandments that we are to honor our parents and everything. Whereas these new narratives don't have that order, so they try and force the order through the state and strip children from the parents, and raise the children arguing this is what it means to be socialized. And this is big part of the sexual revolution too, and speaks to Peugeot's concerns and things Thomas was talking about, the abolition of femininity and masculinity both. And we see that with especially with poor African American women, for example, who are kind of given models like Cardi B and people like that, have been, it's basically the ideas of the sexual revolution that have trickled down and have been handed to these people in, like, again, Taylor's notion of the social imaginary, where they live out these patterns and they think this is freedom and so forth. That they've been sold a lie, if you know what I mean. But it goes across the whole society. But I think it's stark, and the contrast between former generations and now in the African American community makes it more easy to grasp, maybe in some ways. And again, like in my own country in Ireland, we see the same thing, how within one generation society can be so radically changed. And the Irish people were sold this abortion as radical freedom, and this is a woman's right, and this is the centerpiece of what it means to be a civil human being, if you know what I mean. It's kind of, again, that demonic antichrist. So this is strong language, but I think it's justified whenever we put it into its proper context, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, and you'd like to add that.
Yeah. I think this may be, well, we can tie this into I think one of Rod's other main points, which might be like the last main point we can get into about his book, which is because we haven't really talked about it, I guess, is the nature of the soft totalitarianism that we're heading towards, which is very much akin to, I guess, what is depicted in WALL-E, in a way, in a sense that because our culture, our secular culture at least, is so, the ultimate goal is the maximum, I guess, individual happiness or personal happiness to forge your own life and your own destiny and all this sort of stuff, where it's just about satisfying your needs. I'm simplified, of course, but the gist of it is something like that, I suppose, and I guess minimizing suffering. And so because in our culture, it's not like going to be what you have in China. It is more, I guess, harder totalitarianism, but we'll have this culture where we can still order, where we have all this convenience, where we can, let me just turn off my camera, we can get anything we want, like Amazon can can come and give us food. It can like everything can be ordered. Like everything is very convenient. It will become even ever more convenient technologically speaking. We have all these things that make our life easier in a way, which is very similar to what happens to Wall-E. But it also, again, what we talked about the atomization of individuals, it also makes us more vulnerable to, I guess, to authority and especially to the government.
Just before we go then, I guess, I'll just read a little poem because I want to offer Christian hope after it all, because that's what it's about in the end.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of Wordsworth, Longfellow recently. I was telling Thomas about it, and I think he's got a beautiful poem, especially as we're just after Christmas here. I'll read a bit from that because I think it speaks to some of the themes and the ultimate hope that we have as Christians. So I'll not do the whole thing, but he says in Christmas Bells, which he wrote in 1863 during the Civil War. So that was obviously a dreadful period in American history, and something to be wrestled with too. So, and in despair I bowed my head, there is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Goodwill to you both.
That's good. I like that.